This afternoon's meeting of the Audit Committee, everybody. Let's start with apologies for absence.
Good afternoon. There's apologies for absence from Councillors Higginson, Clark, Smith and Woodhouse.
Thanks very much for that. Just to see who's here today who is not a councillor, I'll just ask the people on the top table up here to introduce themselves, starting with Andrew.
Andrew Wathen, Chief Internal Auditor.
Peter Davis, Chief Officer for Resources.
Wendy Barnard, Democratic Services.
Now I see we've got friends from the Wales Audit Office on the front table there. Would you like to introduce yourselves? Anne-Marie, can you press the button on the microphone?
Sorry, my fault. Anne-Marie Harkin, Engagement Director with the Wales Audit Office.
Rodri Davis, Team Leader, Wales Audit Office.
Mark Howcroft, Assistant Head of Finance.
Jonathan Davis, Finance Manager.
And one or two other people dotted around the room in the far corner there, please.
Leslie Russell, Senior Accountant Treasury.
Richard Jones, Performance Manager.
Emma Davis, Performance Officer.
Have I got everyone there? Okay, good. Thanks very much for that. I'm sure it helps anyone watching the live stream to have an idea who's here. Now, next item of interest is formally declarations of interest. We tend to take these as we go along in case unless anyone wants to say something now. If not, I'll move on. We have a public open forum. I see no members of the public present, so I'll move on from that. And then we've got the action list from the previous meeting. I've got one item which is about performance management, which is to be an update to be provided by Peter Davis, the Chief Officer for Resources. So can you give us some information about that?
I think members of the committee will be familiar with this outstanding action. It's been sat on the action list for a while now, and as a consequence of members of the committee not being completely comforted and reassured in terms of progress being made. Whilst the subject matter is performance management, and I believe with Richard Jones here with us as well, I think this stemmed originally from an improvement item that was brought forward to the committee, but it specifically refers to our reporting of staff who have received annual appraisals. So hopefully that refreshes your memory. Just to take you back to the last verbal update I provided to the committee, a situation whereby, and whilst we have got some things in train in the background with our systems that will hopefully improve our ability to be able to both monitor and capture annual appraisals. We have an interim solution in place at the moment. I had highlighted in my previous update that was proving not to actually give us the data capture needed. And so it remained a situation where we didn't have complete and accurate information at our disposal, and in terms of staff appraisals being undertaken across the authority. So the action that was taken from my last update, which was earlier in the summer, was one whereby we were going to look to introduce and incorporate into our service improvement planning process the necessary PI around annual appraisals. That has been included, and I was looking to come to this meeting in the hope that the Q1 data capture from the service improvement plans would give me a very good picture of performance. Unfortunately, and I guess probably symptomatic of some of the teething issues that we've identified, having completed the Q1 performance monitoring, it's highlighted that an array of departments have actually provided responses, and on the one hand, comforting confirmation that staff appraisals have been completed in full. But in other situations, it has been, I guess, completion of the PI data has been somewhat sporadic. We've had situations where that PI data has not been made available. So for me to be able to give you a level of absolute comfort in terms of performance across authority, that's difficult at the moment. What has been brought to the fore, and we've been senior officers in people services, members of the improvement team have been in discussion just in terms of, I guess, taking some of the issues that we have in front of us at the moment and looking to resolve them satisfactorily. The two issues that have come to the fore, one is in terms of guidance. The guidance around the PI, certainly felt, based on feedback, needs strengthening. It doesn't provide enough clarification, we now believe, to service improvement planning managers and in completion of the information. Further to that, we've been having a very useful discussion around some of the practice that's taking place across the authority. I'm sure members of the committee will recognise and understand, in a local authority with a very diverse array of services that are delivered. On the one hand, we have services where staff are office-based, and on the other, we have blue-collar workers who are working on the front line. And therefore, the nature of what might constitute an annual appraisal will differ. In terms of certain situations, it may be a case whereby there may not be an annual formal appraisal in what maybe you and I interpret that as being. It may be in the form of, for example, supervision that may take place throughout the year. So what we're now looking to do is to actually provide greater clarification and guidance to managers on what actually constitutes a satisfactory form of appraisal. And to actually identify those areas of the business where an annual appraisal, in the way that we understand it, as being undertaken, and in fact in other areas where different modes of appraisal are undertaken. So an apology on the one hand. As I said, I would have hoped to have got into a position of coming to the meeting today and giving you some solidity around our performance. We're not quite there yet. We will continue working through now, certainly ahead of the next quarter reporting and quarter two, and obviously look to make the necessary improvements.
So are you saying then that you're going to come back to the committee again with a fuller report after the next quarter?
Certainly, in terms of the specific action points that I guess officers are tasked with taking away, and as I've just described, that work will be seen through in earnest now, guidance being provided and refined, and reinforcing again to managers the need to provide that information as part of their quarterly updates. I'm keen to really get this one sorted out and almost moved aside. It's I guess not just a personal frustration of mine, it's probably a personal frustration of Richard's as well. But beyond the simple collation of staff who actually receive appraisals, there is probably a more important matter, which is actually more difficult to capture data on, which is actually around the quality of those appraisals. But let's in the first instance, Chair, let's just get this first action out of the way. That remains on the action list, and at least then we can subsequently focus our efforts on the quality of the appraisals themselves.
Thank you for that. Does anyone have any points they wish to raise? Any further questions they want to ask? Councillor Murphy.
I just support that idea, Chair. Clearly this is a moving situation. It does need following up, and as soon as that further information comes, it would be worth us having it. So yeah, I think we should leave it on the list and review it every time until we're satisfied that it's complete.
Thanks for that. It'll certainly, I think, stay on our list for future action, unless Mr. Davis wants to put it forward as a paper for a future meeting.
I think we'll determine that coming back to Councillor Murphy's input. If we're not suitably positioned for the next meeting, obviously it will be a verbal update. But at the point at which we have got that robust information, then I'll bring that together in a written update. Absolutely.
So we leave that as an action point. Anything else from members of the committee? Because if not, thank you for that, and I'll move on I'm going to move on now to items 5 and 6 on the agenda. We've got item 5 is the ISA 260 response to accounts, which is the Welsh Audit Office audit of the financial statements report. And I want to take it jointly with item 6, the audited statement of accounts 2018-19. And the way I'd like to do this is I would like the Welsh Audit Office to provide us with an introduction, a summary of what they've got there, and I'd be asking for an introduction to the second paper and a response to what issues raised from MCC officers, and that I believe will be Mark Howcroft or Jonathan Davis doing that. I note that the accounts at item 6 have already been seen by the committee in draft, so I would not expect intensive discussions about that particular set of information. But I wouldn't wish to prevent any committee member from raising any issue that they feel is relevant. So can I hand it over now to our friends from the Welsh Audit Office?
Thank you, Chair. Okay, so this is our ISA 260 report. It's a report that we're required by auditing standards to bring to you, and it sets out the results of our audit of the financial statements for 18-19. So as we say in paragraph 6, we received the draft accounts on the 4th of June, as agreed, and we have now finished our work. The good news is that we are proposing an unqualified audit opinion, which is great. In terms of significant issues arising from the audit, we set out in paragraph 10 a number of uncorrected misstatements that remain in the accounts. The first of those is to do with the disclosure of an additional pension liability as a contingent liability rather than a provision in the accounts, which means that, in our view, the pension liability is understated by 1.9 million. That relates to a legal ruling arising from changes to the local government pension fund, not just this one, but right across the piece. The second uncorrected misstatement there relates to a failure to consolidate the council's or some of the council's associates and joint ventures. I'm sure Mark will respond to this in due course. What the council has done is consolidate the largest, the Cardiff Capital Region City Deal Joint Committee, but there are a small number of other joint ventures and associates that haven't been included for this year or consolidated for this year. That results in a net understatement on the financial statements of net assets and reserves of 800,000. And then we mentioned there, third bullet point, an uncorrected misstatement arising from the continued inclusion in expenditure for 18-19 of amounts expenditure that relates essentially to this financial year, 19-20, and there are no prepayments to take account of that. So again, if we were to extrapolate that across the whole population, we'd be looking at about 178,000. What I would say is we have to bring those uncorrected misstatements to your attention because they're above our trivial level that we set for the audit, but they are not individually or collectively material. So you don't have to adjust for them, and it does not impact our audit opinion on the financial statements. Okay. I'm very happy to take any sort of questions on any of those. In terms of corrected misstatements, there are, as you would expect in an audit this size and a set of accounts this size, that there are some misstatements that have been corrected by management. And we have to draw those to your attention because they're over the trivial level. I wasn't proposing to talk you through those in detail, but we can do if that would be helpful to you. In terms then of how the audit went, well, it all proceeded very smoothly again this year. I'm extremely grateful for the support and the cooperation that's extended by Peter, Mark and the rest of the finance team. It's really helpful that we can work together so closely to meet what is an ever increasingly challenging deadline for submission of these accounts. As you'd expect, some areas for improvement. I won't dwell on those. We've mentioned previously the roundings and the fact that there are a large number of rounding errors remaining in the accounts. And And also, I think, as we mentioned there in paragraph 12, it's important that we have all the required working papers available for us when we have agreed that they would be available. We are under an increasingly tight timetable here, and we do need all of those papers in order to proceed with the audit smoothly. But generally, and absolutely, well, a very good audit process. Finally, then, what I do need to do in paragraphs 13 and 14 is bring your attention to the mention there of our independence and objectivity. We have complied with ethical standards in undertaking our work, and in our professional judgment, our independence and objectivity has not been compromised. So, by way of an introduction, that's probably as much as I would want to say. Very happy to take any questions, or for Mark to respond and then take any questions after that, Chair.
I think that's right. That Mark, his paper is largely a response in any case to the audit. So I think Mark should introduce his paper before we open it out any more widely for discussion. But no doubt, if there are particular points you want clarification on, members of the committee, you can do that at the appropriate time. So over to you, Mark.
Okay. The report is twofold, really. It identifies the final accounts that you presented with and asked to sign off today. And you may remember that actually we're trialling a different process for this year specifically, that the leader will get his comfort to sign off the accounts on the basis of the audit committee's viewpoint, rather than traditionally the case that the audit committee endorses his accounts to full council and there be a further conversation around full council. There's nothing particularly sinister about that. It reflects the fact that actually this year there are shortening timescales around the statement of accounts, which meant that we have to physically present our accounts by the mid-September. You'll appreciate that full council is after that deadline, and actually a report went to full council earlier in the year to explain the pragmatism that rather than adjust the timescale for full council and bring it forward, that actually would members be prepared to accept this 1 year trial basis. It also gives us the opportunity, we're required to respond to the specifics of the ISA 260, the 3 items of material misstatement. We don't necessarily have to respond to the remainder of the items, although what we've helpfully done is ourselves and the auditors prepare something called a joint progress document that you would normally see around about January, February time as a prelude to the start of the following year's audit, that actually explains to you what progress is being made, what our stance is on the smaller items. So as to the 3 items that are regarded as material misstatements, I can appreciate from any reader's point of view that might be quite horrifying for you. Let me reassure you about some of the thinking about this. The pension liability, members may recall that the central government changed the public sector pension provisions back in 2015. In recognising that it was changing them, what it did at the time was provide a protection for those that were approaching retirement age. Since that period of 2015, it's been backwards and forwards through the courts, largely in testing out the pension provisions for firefighters and judges, which is where the MacLeod names come from, because it's the case law that was testing out the fact that actually in providing such protections to a small group of people approaching retirement age, that actually there was an age discriminatory aspect to the change. Even though it's mentioned that actually the Court of Appeal considered it in December 2018, it actually went to the Supreme Court in June 2019, after the year of the accounts were actually presented, and the Supreme Court upheld the Court of Appeal judgment and precluded the government from any further appeals. So the response to that was that the government said, well, yes, we acknowledge that, and we have to work with the industrial tribunals to provide a remedy to such. So what we've done is we actually calculated the likely effect of it, showed it as both a post-statement event and also a contingent liability. Now, the difference between a contingent liability and a provision is quite a technical one being as to whether it will likely be materialised or not. At the moment, the government haven't yet been clear, because they're still to do that work with industrial tribunals, as to what their remedy will be. They could provide a cash consideration to it, and certainly Treasury officials have been saying, well, actually, in remedying this in cash terms, this would potentially cost the public purse £5 billion. It could decide to roll back its 2015 adjustments, or it could actually passport the effect of that to pension funds and expect them to manage that arrangement. Our thought was that if we added those to the liability of the pension funds, that might inappropriately and inherently suggest to you that actually it's a pension fund responsibility. That decision has not yet been reached. In relation to the second item, our accounting policies in the forward to the accounts has always recognised that we don't consolidate our joint concerns. This is largely because they're of an immaterial level. The one difference was around City Deal, which is our 10 authority regional partnership, that was always anticipated to be of such magnitude that we would need to consolidate them. The reason why it's appeared as an adjusted entry in this year's accounts is that between our draft version and the final figures, the figures actually exceeded that materiality level and needed to be added to the accounts. We wouldn't ordinarily choose to incorporate our joint committee items more generally, and actually just introducing the City Deal is consistent with that traditional approach we've adopted. I am going to be looking at how we consolidate our accounts going forward, because I think actually the incorporation of the City Deal figures in with the council figures doesn't actually aid a great deal of transparency to the activities of the council. I come from a housing background which is commonly uses group account structures and actually different columns to actually show those consolidation adjustments. What I need to do is just have a reflection on this as to whether there's a better way to show those consolidation adjustments in perhaps a first column being the local authority, second column being consolidation adjustments, and then by association the third column being the collective effect. But we've done what we needed to for this financial year to achieve a cleared audit. The third one's an interesting one, because I described to you that the auditors have a job to bring forward their timescales of preparation of the accounts, as do ourselves. Ultimately, you may remember from previous years, we're expected to provide our accounts by the end of May for them to be signed off by the end of July. That's the end game for all local authorities. So we have taken 4 weeks out of the process effectively from the production point of view already. We're going to have to take another 4 weeks out of it. In going on the training courses that other authorities have provided in relation to shorter timescales and WAO workshops, there's a recognition that that will involve a degree of estimation. And actually, I put this categorization here as being one of the consequences of that. Just to give you a flavour of it, things like utility payments, insurance payments don't necessarily accord easily with a financial year. So you may very well get a bill for the year that starts in May time and carries forward for the next April. The suggestion here is that we ought to have extracted the April payment and actually transferred it into the 1920 accounts. What we've instead done is made sure that there is 12 months worth of activity in the accounts. It's quoted that expenditure is overstated by 178,000, but if we actually move that forward into the next financial year, we should also be removing the equivalent from the last financial year. And if you actually compare the 178 to the 177 that would be moving in, they largely cancel each other out. Because I don't have a finance team that predominantly deals with statement of accounts, they deal with budget monitoring, savings, materialisation, etc. It is increasingly difficult for me to balance the extra amount of time in relation to statement of accounts and what that will mean in terms of monitoring. So understanding that I've got a shortened timescale, some of these things I look to do to actually assist with that process. And I think you'll find that over the next couple of years, as people get more wedded to these shorter timescales, that some of these pragmatisms will get more embedded and more well, reported, not necessarily as a material misstatement, but as an understanding to the accounts there. I'm happy to take you through any of the JPD aspects that appeal to you, but what I would say with all of those aspects, There is no headline consequence to the main accounting statements. They have refinements to the working papers and are designed to help the reader in terms of their the readability. The one point I keep belabouring is the shortened timescales, and obviously the auditors have reminded us that that those are best addressed through close working with the finance team and WAO. I think we do have a good working relationship with them. But actually one of my reflections this year is that actually the accounts, which traditionally used to be accountancy team driven, there's a need for a lot more information from other sectors of the accounts, from other sections of the council. So for instance, Andrew will manage the process around the annual governance statement with members and facilitate that. Richard at the back there will provide the non-financial information that goes into that. And there's also a degree of work around valuation, which is key to the shortening of the timescales, because fixed assets will always be the single biggest item in any local authority's accounts. So I think what we will need to be doing this next year is how we actually incorporate the roles of those teams within the timetable for closure of accounts. At that point, I'm happy to take any queries.
Thank you, Mark. Just might be helpful to note the recommendations in Mark's paper. The recommendation that the final Monmouthshire County Council Statement of Accounts for 2018-19 be accepted as a true and fair view of the Council Statement of Accounts and approved for publication by the statutory deadline of the 15th of September 2019, and that the year-end financial reporting refinements outlined in the joint progress document, which is Appendix 2 of Mark's paper, are accepted and implemented where agreed by the authority in preparation for the 2019-20 Statement of Accounts. So that's what we're here to do today. So I'd like to throw it open to questions and observations, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much. And it's an observation, really, for the Welsh Audit Office as much as it is for us. We're obviously in the Audit Committee, and we've got a degree of knowledge, I suppose, and built-up knowledge over the period of time that we've been here, of understanding the accounts and understanding the language around them and understanding how they work, and listening to Mark's responses then to the uncorrected misstatements. It's very easy on the ear, and as much as they respond fully, in my thinking, to how it's been presented in your report. And with that in mind, bearing in mind that we're trying to present something for the layperson to read, and we're trying to present something that the layperson can understand in more simplistic terms. And it's not a criticism at all, but maybe it's an observation from someone who's not as heavily entrenched into the accountancy world as what other people are. But just some of the language around that could be quite negative, if you like, whereas it's probably not as negative as what it is at first glance. It just, like I say, it's only an observation that maybe when these reports are presented, some thought could go into the wording of those statements, because as it reads, the pension liability understated by £1.9 million, that as a headline figure to go into the local paper is very significant. But it needn't be, because there is an explanation for it, notwithstanding that they are your observations. But all I'm thinking is that maybe, without being too fettered with it, that you could be presenting that information in a slightly different tone that would be easier for lay people to read without it being misconceived in any way. So that's only one observation. The other observation would be just going on to the rounding element, and as much as that, as it states, we have some concerns about the qualitative aspects of your accounting practices and finance report in regarding to the rounding errors in excess of £100. It would be good to see that in context as well, to see how many of those errors there are in excess of £100.
Yes, you can.
Sorry. The rounding errors are £1,000 each. Okay. So, and there's in excess of 100 rounding errors. Right, okay. So just to clarify that, they're not £100. There's £1,000 rounding errors in excess of 100 of these. Okay.
That isn't really written within that very clearly. But Theo responded already.
Okay.
Yeah, it looks like it's written. It looks like it looks like you're rounding errors at £100, and just in the context of a £150 million budget,
Yeah, no.
£100 is
It's
maybe
nothing.
too. Yeah, there you got. You know, we're on the same page. Okay.
Councillor Feekins has made an observation there. I don't know if you want to respond to his general observation at this point. It's entirely up to you.
I mean, the only point I would say is that we're required by auditing standards to bring these uncorrected misstatements to your attention, that in our view, it is an understatement of 1.9 million. I think we've put that forward in a very balanced way. As I mentioned, it's above our trivial level, so if I did not bring that to your attention, I would be failing in my duty. What I did, however, say was that because it is not material, I, would request that you adjust it, but I'm not going to qualify the auditor opinion if you don't. So I'm not entirely sure in what other way you would like me to say that, really. But that's the point. As far as we are concerned, there is an error of 1.9 million in the accounts.
Councillor Murphy, do you have a follow-up to that?
Yes, thank you, Chair. This isn't the first time this 1.9 million's been there. We've had this set for several years running now, haven't we? And until such time as it becomes absolutely clear, we've always accepted as an audit committee that it is missing from the accounts. We know about it. You've rightly brought it to our attention again. So, at some stage it will become absolutely clear what needs to be done, and we, along with every other authority, no doubt will make the necessary adjustment. I don't know whether Mark wants to add to that.
Well, I did see a shaking head down here at the front, so you might want to just put us right on that.
Yeah, firstly, I'm not sure it's a new, it's a long-standing item, it's new for this year. If I could just be a statesman, what I'm not suggesting in volunteering an opinion here is that I disagree with my colleagues in Wales Audit Office. Traditionally, what would happen is that there is normally a degree of interpretation around accounting requirements and standards, etc. And what would normally happen is that they would normally look at a situation as to whether that was reasonable, whether it conveys or infers an unreasonable presentation. This year, in common with England, they've taken a stance that actually they have a preference for how it is shown. And I respect that opinion. Actually, your opinion changed through the audit as a result of a number of conversations within WAO. So there are varieties of opinions within the organisation, but their general opinion, and one of their roles is to introduce consistency across local authorities, was that it ought to be treated in this particular way. The responsibility to prepare the accounts always rests with the local authority and the professional people that you employ. So we will have regard for their information, and where we will bend and can bend, we will do so. That's part of our relationship management with the auditors. There are some things around pension funds that actually we acknowledge that are quite emotive in nature. And so prudently, we wouldn't necessarily add to that liability until we were fairly certain that that liability would fall to the membership. So in providing you with a perspective which I'm required to do, it doesn't invalidate WAO's view, but I hope that you can just appreciate that actually in having two perspectives, you can come to a considered view on it.
Just for a point of clarification, Anne-Marie Harkin, can you explain why it was not, why it was immaterial? I think you used that term.
We set a level of materiality for the financial statements, which we set out earlier on, is 2.9 million, and because this falls beneath it, it's not material. Materiality is the level of error that I suppose, not that we're prepared to accept, but that we believe would influence the users of the account. So in terms of the user of the account, what would they consider to be material? What level of interest have they got? So that's how we set it. And it's sort of, as Mark says, it's one of those things which is common really to accountants, auditors. We set a level of materiality based on your expenditure as an organisation, level of interest etc. The level of materiality that we use is a percentage, and that percentage, again, on this sort of consistency point, is right across all local government bodies in Wales as well.
Thank you for that. I thought that was very helpful. I was aware of the general principle of materiality. I was just forgotten what the amount was at that point. It seemed quite a large number, but you've explained it. I'm going to go over to someone else, unless you just... Councillor Murphy, you're just going back on this.
There was quite a few items later on which are swings and roundabouts, really. Will we be adjusting those during the next year? I'm thinking mostly around stuff to do with the investment committee and various things. It was just things posted to different lines, and the net effect was nil.
Yeah, we will always use the previous year's feedback from the accounts to inform our process, which is why I said the JPD normally comes to members round about February, March time. It's probably more useful for us to dust it off in February, March time than it is yourselves in terms of understanding what's required. And this will be subject to a lesson learned approach, and myself and John will be going through the accounts as to what refinements we can make to those accounts.
Thank you. Councillor Eason.
Thank you, Chair. I got one question and a comment. I noticed that in the annual accounts, which we've thrashed a few times, there are no real problems. I noticed that the independent auditors report is slipped in the middle there, which I've never seen that before. It's page 63. I only found it because it's in red, but it's quite positive as far as I'm concerned, so I have no issues with item 6 on the accounts. But I go back to the report on item 5, which you presented, and within that, you presented us with the final letter of representation from yourself, Mr. White, and Mr. Matthews, will be signed off today. I got concerns about the information provided. It does worry me a bit. There's a number of points on there, but bullet point 2 says, the results of our assessment of the risk that the financial statements may be materially misstated as a result of fraud. And then we tick down further on down the line, and bullet point 6, the identity of all related parties and all the related party relationships and transactions which we are aware. Has anything come to the audit committee before regarding material problems with fraud? If not, when will it be coming to the audit committee? Because I feel that that's not a bold statement, I can't think of the right word, but it's a statement which gives me concern that there was an impression there was some fraud happened in that year. Is it correct?
I'm happy for Mark for you to take this, and I know Rodri has made a suggestion, so you may want to tell us about that as well.
The emphasis is such in asking the authority that the auditors are looking at the accounts over. It's a tick and balance to check that whether you're aware of any conditions. It's not saying that there are any conditions, it's whether you're aware of any conditions that you feel aren't accurately represented in the accounts. So, for instance, there are instances across the private sector where there are fraud issues that should very well be acknowledged in the accountancy records that aren't. I mean, if you could help me out, it's a fairly common question that you ask all local authorities in terms of fraud assessment.
Yeah, these questions, they're standard international audit standards questions that you would do. So you would ask those charged with governance, what is the risk that the accounts could be materially misstated as a result of fraud? Usually it comes back low risk because we're talking in terms of 3 million. And usually within the sort of county council, the fraud, there might be some fraud. I'm not saying there is, but there might be some fraud in the year, but it wouldn't be to the extent of being 3 million. So that's something that we have to comply with. We'll ask has there been any instances of fraud in the year? Again, in terms of materiality. And the other point that we need to ask is about related parties and whether these related parties are complete. So they are standard, like auditing standard questions. There's nothing in this template that is anything different from our standard template. So sometimes in a letter of representation, we'll ask those charged with governance for specific representations. Maybe we haven't got enough support and evidence over a creditor or a debtor balance. We were unable to provide that, and we'll ask you to provide assurance that it's okay. But there's nothing in this letter of rep that's out of the ordinary. It's a standard letter of representation. So
I read the letter with some trepidation, and as much as it guides me down the direction that it might be fraud, not there might not be fraud.
Yes, Mr. Watson.
Thanks. Just to add to what WAO has said as well, Mark, myself and Peter get consulted on this. It's an annual document which WAO present to us. It just so happens this is the first time it's come to Audit Committee for technical reasons. So we're assured that there are no material frauds going on within the organisation, and we complete that and we send it back to WAO.
I was going to say that was my understanding of where we were. It's and a lot of this is about whether you've taken the due steps to make sure that you found out everything you can find out and so on. And of course, for the first time, my signature goes on the bottom of this, so I do have a bit more of a motivation to get this one right. Any other questions or observations on this set of papers at this time? In which case I would just like to note the recommendations and yes, that we've accepted the statement of accounts as a true and fair view and approved for publication, and that the financial reporting refinements outlined in the joint progress document are accepted and implemented in preparation for the 1920 statement of accounts. So thank you very much, everybody. That's an important stage to have got through.
Now that you've seen the recommendations through, can I just take an opportunity? I know Anne-Marie did the same from her perspective and a WAO perspective earlier, but can I just like to, I guess, formally on the record, offer my thanks to Mark, John, and the wider teams who have contributed to bringing together the accounts. Also, a really good working relationship with WAO, and obviously concluding the audit successfully. So I just wanted to just make that point and for the record, really, just to offer my thanks.
Thanks for that. And thanks on behalf of the committee as well. I'm going to move on then to our next item, which is the Treasury Outturn Report 2018 and 19. This is to be presented by Jonathan. Yes.
Thank you, Chair. Before we start on this, I just wanted to make members aware that this document, it comes annually to this committee, and it's in a different format this time around. We've presented it in a standard report format rather than traditionally presenting as an appendix. We had previous feedback from the committee that it was quite difficult to interpret given the technical nature of this document. Obviously, the content of this is highly governed by the statutory guidance, so where possible we've attempted to tailor it to give it a local context to Monmouthshire, and I hope that providing it in this format makes it a little bit easier to read for yourselves. So the Treasury Management Code provided by SIPFA requires that members charged with governance receive a report on Treasury management activity at least twice a year. And this is the second report for the 2018-19 financial year. Within it, we can confirm that the Council has operated within the limits and boundaries set by the Code and by the Council's own Treasury strategy, which was approved by Council well back now in the 6th of March 2018. The specific compliance with the limits is outlined in paragraphs 9 to 11 of this report. They're quite numerous, so I'm not proposing to go through them in detail. This year, the Treasury Management Code covers non-Treasury investments as well as Treasury investments, and it requires authorities to show how we've provided due diligence on these investments in the same way that it does for the traditional Treasury investments. So we're talking here about things like the solar farm, business parks, industrial units and our agricultural holdings. So within paragraph 8 to this report, you'll see a new section outlining our approach to these items of investment. In terms of the key movements during the year, just two main things to highlight to yourselves is that borrowings increased by 49 million during the year. This is mainly due to the planned funding of the purchases of both the Newport Leisure Park and Castlegate Business Park. Investments have increased marginally by 3 million, and this mainly reflects the timing difference between the income we receive and the expenditure that we incur. I'm not proposing to go into further detail. You'll be glad to know on the economic background or any specific Treasury movements and limits, but welcome to take any questions, Chair.
Okay, I'll throw that open then to questions and observations. Councillor Easton.
Yeah, thank you. Just one question. It's on point 9.2. We as members supported the investment committee in moving forward in Castlegate Park and Newport Leisure Park. But it says here that the total debt rose above the operational boundary on the 7th of March when we did that, I take it was, when the loan was taken out to pay for the purchase of that park, which had not been allowed in the operational boundary included in the 1890 Treasury strategy. Will the Treasury strategy be adjusted in the next year if we continue on the investment committee's recommendations?
Can I just explain a bit more detail about operational boundaries and authorised limit? For planning purposes, it's useful to set an operational boundary before you reach your absolute limit that you've set yourself. That actually encourages you to actually relook at your borrowing levels and whether they're appropriate or not. So whilst within the overall scheme of things, Castlegate and Newport Leisure would have been within the absolute figure we set ourselves, it would have been above the operational limit that we would have set for last financial year. Simplistically, because we presumed, rather naively, but we didn't have any more information than that. You may remember full council gave a delegation to the investment committee to incur £50 million over 3 years. So we use a straight line basis for that in the absence of any further information. It's unlikely that was ever going to likely to be the case, but obviously we've incurred nearly £30 million in the one financial year. So it exceeded the operational limit, but not the absolute limit. We probably wouldn't adjust the operational limit going forward because there won't be a need to, given the fact that this volatility or this hump in expenditure has been incurred in this year, and you probably wouldn't want to set your operational limit much closer to the absolute limit without it actually losing some of its significance to be able to test where you are. But the one thing I would remind you all is that one of the important tenets of the commercial investment is that whilst it is to provide a net return to the council to help sustain services, first and foremost, it must show that it pays for itself. So in other words, that the financial borrowing is affordable. So even though we've exceeded the operational boundary, members shouldn't conclude that that means that we have a problem with affordability here.
Any other questions or observations from members of the committee? In which case, let's just remind ourselves of the recommendation. Members note the results of Treasury management activities and performance achieved in 2018 and 19 as part of their delegated responsibility to provide scrutiny of Treasury policy, strategy and activity on behalf of the Council. So I can record that as duly noted. And I'll move on then to the next item on the agenda. Which is a progress report on Wales Audit Office proposals for improvement. And this is to be presented by Richard Jones, I believe.
Thank you, Chair. A bit musical chairs there. Good afternoon, everyone. My colleague Emma Davis has not got a seat at the front, but I'm sure will help and answer any questions if needed later on. So here to present to you the update on progress with Wales Audit Office proposal for improvement up to September 2019. And this builds on the regular reporting in place. The last update we brought to you was in November 2018. So hopefully the content and the structure of the report is familiar to Audit Committee. Audit Committee will be familiar that Wales Audit Office each year undertake a performance audit work programme with the Council. And as a result of these audits, they can make a number of interventions, and the level of those is set out in point 3.1 of the report. All the issues contained in the report are known as proposals for improvement, so the lower end of those interventions. And proposals are those which Wales Audit Office expect us to act upon, and we'll follow up what happens with those. Ultimately, though, it's up to the Council to decide how we choose to address them. And so the proposals in the report stem from the performance audit work programme undertaken since the last corporate assessment in March 2015 for those proposals that remained open from the last update in November. And hopefully each of those specific proposals will be familiar to members as the actual reports that they're issued in and the management responses to those reports are reported to Audit Committee as they are produced. The report is split into three sections. Appendix 1, which contains the open proposals for improvement. So those are which we've deemed that we require further progress in order to address the issues raised by Wales Audit Office. And the structure of the report shows you the proposals that have been issued, or more than one proposal if they are closely linked and our action to address them is linked. The progress we've made so far to address that proposal, and then the further actions planned in order to address it. Appendix 2 provides you with the closed proposals for improvement, and those are which we've assessed that we have now made adequate progress in addressing the issue raised in the proposal, and that it can now be closed or removed from monitoring, albeit there may be some issues that are continuing as part of our ongoing processes, as you would expect as part of our arrangements. And the third section, Appendix 3, provides you with the outputs of local government national reports completed by Wales Audit Office. And now, although these reports aren't issued directly to Council, like our other local reports are, they may contain recommendations that are relevant to Council services. So bringing these together in report highlights to Audit Committee what the recommendations of those reports are, a very brief summary of the outcome of that audit and a link to the full report should the committee wish to read it further, and also then which of the Council services is responsible for that area and what they've done in terms of receiving that report. And part of your role as Audit Committee is to potentially suggest where you think it's relevant to coordinate where other committees may find those reports of interest, to suggest that they review them. So hopefully that provides you with a bit of a background to the report. One other thing I think worth bringing to your attention is the annual improvement report that you would have received recently at Audit Committee that basically provides a summary view of the Council's activity and prospects for improvement in the year. And point 3.6 sets out the conclusion to that, which is that the Council is meeting its statutory requirements in relation to continuous improvements, and that based on limited the work carried out by Wales Audit Office and relevant regulators, the Auditor General believes that the Council is likely to comply with its requirements of Local Government Measure 2009 during 2019-20. So hopefully that gives you a background of where the work's come from and what the report contains. Happy to take any questions in line with the recommendations, Chair. Maybe worth recognising that obviously the report covers a number of different Council service areas, and if there's any specialist questions from the committee, we may need to get back to them with written responses from those responsible for those areas.
Thank you for that. Yes, I'll open it up then to questions and observations from members of the committee, please.
Thank you. Sorry, I was scanning ahead and I've lost back where I was looking before. There it is. So it's the things it's mostly commenting, and it's partly in my capacity as the chair of the Democratic Services Committee. I note that there are a number of still open actions which are to be forwarded in terms of democratic services and scrutiny. I feel like there's a rather ambitious timetable still put on that, maybe, considering the amount of time it's taking to actually try and get the forward work planners properly embedded throughout the whole of the council. So are you confident with the timescales that you've put on to those ones?
Yeah, Chair, if you're happy for me to come in.
Yes, I'm
apologies, just
happy for
joining for
Mr.
this
Gatehouse
item.
to answer the question.
As Councillor Watkins mentioned, this has been something which is on the radar and something that Democratic Services Committee have been looking to progress for some time. My confidence is increasing as we're shortly about to begin recruitment of some additional capacity into that space. We're changing some of the working arrangements, so some of the structural changes have been embedded. So I feel far more confident now that we'll be able to make some real headway in this area, and indeed far more confident than had you asked me the same question perhaps in late May or early June.
Thanks for that. Do we have any other questions or observations on this paper? If not, I'll just remind ourselves about the recommendations. That members consider the current position of proposals and future actions being taken to address them, seeking assurance that adequate progress is made. I would read that we have considered it, and we certainly had a question about seeking assurance, so thank you for that, committee. And then we'll goes on to say members may refer any issues contained within Wales Audit Office national studies to other committees for consideration where they identify there are findings of particular relevance to the Council. Well, since no one's chosen to raise any of those items, then I don't think we need to act on that. So I'm going to move on to the next item on the agenda then, which is the Internal Audit Progress Report for the first 3 months of 1920. Over to Mr. Wathen.
Thank you, Chairman. Afternoon, members. Hopefully members will be familiar with this report format. This is a regular report that I bring to your attention based on the performance and progress against the agreed audit plan, performance of the internal audit team, and this is the Q1 performance progress report as at the 30th of June 2019. It may look a bit thin on the ground, but I can explain that as we go through the process. So we've started work against the 2019-20 agreed operational audit plan. And although we've started around about 30% of the work, we've only realised 11% of that to draft report stage. And of that 11%, there are 2 opinions which have been issued, which I'll come on to in a moment. One of which is a substantial assurance and one is limited assurance. And the overall intention of providing this report is to provide assurance to members around the internal control environment, the governance arrangements and risk management processes in operation of the Council. And as we could progress through the quarters, and my feedback to you as members, that will hopefully increase as we move forward in the year. So part of what we've been doing in Q1 is finalising draft reports which were outstanding as at the 31st of March. And also involved with performance indicators corporately, some grant claims, some special investigations, and also providing some financial advice across all services. So of the work that was at draft at the end of the year, there were 26 reviews at draft report stage only. 10 have subsequently been finalised with 2 considerable opinions, 4 reasonable opinions and 3 limited opinions with 1 unqualified grant claim. And that was as at 30th of June, so we've moved forward since then, and I'll be providing a further update on at the position as at 30th September in due course. If I could take members through to the appendix then on page 193 of your pack, that details the actual jobs which we've given an opinion on. So one is on national performance indicators and one is at Castle Park Primary School. We have given that a limited opinion, and the reason why we've given that as a limited opinion will come out in a further report to Audit Committee, which will be my 6-month update on unfavourable audit opinions in due course. Then we go on to list the added value audit work which we've undertaken. And then finally the performance table on page 196 gives a presentation of year-on-year analysis and quarter-by-quarter analysis, and the highlighted figure for quarter 1 shows where we are as at the 30th of June. So the key indicator there is the percentage of planned audits completed against the plan. That's 11% against a target of 12%, so we're there or thereabouts. And we're issuing reports on a timely basis in terms of getting draft reports out. There's been a little bit of a delay in getting finalised reports out because that's what we've concentrated on, getting as many draft reports out at the year end as possible. And I'm happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you. Questions and observations from members of the committee, please. Councillor Watkins.
I suspect you're going to tell me I've got to wait till your 6-monthly report, but is there any more detail you can give me about Castle Park Primaries Limited? It says it's a low risk, but is there anything?
Okay, it was low risk in terms of our audit planning process, but when we go through and we do our testing out at the school, things weren't as good as they should have been. I can't give you any details at the moment, but all that information will be summarised in the 6-month update.
Thank you. Any other questions or observations? If not, I'll just remind the committee of the recommendation that the committee note the audit opinions issues, as duly noted, and that the committee note progress made by section towards meeting the 2019-20 operational audit plan and the section's performance indicators at the 3-month stage of the financial year. So I think I can say that we have noted that. So thank you very much, Mr. Wathen. The next item on the agenda is the anti-bribery compliance update and annual risk assessment, which is going to be a presentation by Peter Davis. So if we've got the technology working, you should have copies of the presentation in your packs anyway.
I will try not to move suddenly, as the connection is not particularly good. Okay, thank you, everybody. You may remember earlier in the year I provided an update on anti-bribery compliance. That was as a consequence of us having received 2 subsequent limited audit opinions. One of the specific recommendations coming from those audits was the need to undertake a risk assessment, an annual risk assessment, and around risks around anti-bribery, fraud and corruption. We've scheduled this in to come back into the committee, but equally, beyond just simply the risk assessment, I'm also taking an opportunity, and given the 2 limited audit opinions, giving members of the committee an opportunity to provide further update, as I said I would do, in terms of those residual matters needing attention. So As is in your packs, I've just sort of described all of that, and I will finish off as I come to the end of my presentation in just sort of outlining some of those next steps. So just in terms of the current policy, and I went through this quite thoroughly when we met earlier in the year. It was most recently approved in 2017. That was again as a consequence of the audit. And as can be seen in the presentation content, it's important here in terms of its purpose, and I'll come on to some of the internal audit sort of findings in a moment. But that whole point around culture is very, very important. And as is the case that where we do have allegations, certainly particularly where found, that we're providing that strong message both in a firm and consistent way. But as I'll touch on again later, culture here is hugely important because practice, we can have really good controls in place, but if they're not operating, then we're still falling short. Equally, to recognise, the council is one of, I think, probably the largest organisation in the county, and obviously the flow through of monies highlight that anti-bribery, fraud, and corruption needs to be very firmly on our radar. In terms of sort of update, really. In terms of touch points with the audit committee, the committee updated a revised policy back in 2017. Again, you can see the sort of flow through there in terms of the limited opinions being equally considered by audit committee, cabinet having then subsequently approving the policy, and then again in May 2018 the conclusion of the follow-up audit again being shared with the committee. What I'm looking to do today is, I guess, as I've suggested, but importantly, there is a follow-up audit, second follow-up audit. Second follow-up audit that is being undertaken at the moment. The report is currently in draft, and I guess with Andrew and his senior colleagues in the internal audit team for review. I had the opportunity, the benefit ahead of the meeting today, of meeting with the senior auditor who undertook the follow-up review and some other internal audit colleagues, just that I could get a feel for how the follow-up audit has gone. And beyond, I guess, what I knew already in terms of controls and progress in terms of implementing them, I was wanting to get a good feel for sort of practice, as I said, and some of the testing that they've undertaken to confirm as to whether those controls are operating effectively. So again, just before I guess we sort of move forward, let's just refresh our memories. The original audit review, with that limited level of assurance, that brought forward 16 significant moderate recommendations. The subsequent follow-up review identified that only 3 of those had been fully implemented. And obviously for that reason, there was a second limited level of assurance. As I said, I provided an update to Audit Committee. That was in March, and I was able to highlight the good progress that has been made, is being made, in addressing the recommendations. And I guess in terms of those that remained, and I know that the committee were keen for me to bring further update today in progress on these matters, but there were still some shortcomings around induction training, in terms of specifically training around the Bribery Act. Thirdly, and what I'm looking to do here today, undertaking periodic risk assessments and again reporting these up into Audit Committee. And then finally, a number of recommendations that centred around procurement and our contract procedure rules, which you can sort of see itemised there. I don't need to list them all out. So by way of sort of further update and beyond our meeting in March, we are still having issue with induction training. I did highlight when we met in March, and it is a future system development with our HR payroll systems. We are hoping to have a more seamless system-driven solution that will actually incorporate and ahead of people joining the organisation the necessary level of induction. However, we are not at that stage yet, and for such a significant system implementation, that's likely to be another 12 to 18 months off. Just by way of sort of wider insight for the committee, our current contract with our current system provider is coming to an end. We have taken procurement advice, we're unable to extend that, and therefore we are currently in the throes of having done a visioning exercise, drawing up a specification for a new system, and then we will then, as a result, be going to the market to source a new solution. So as you can understand, and again, for a very significant system, this is going to take some time to get that implemented and to address this issue with induction in this seamless system-driven way that I've described. So what that does highlight, and with the fact that this remains an outstanding recommendation, we do need an interim solution. So I have been in close discussion with Tracy Harry, the head of people, but also colleagues in our training department who oversee and run the induction programme. The data capture has improved. We are now getting information through to our training teams on new starters, but suffice to say we are still not seeing 100% of our new starters working their way through the programme. So, as I said, I've met with the team. We are going to enhance our reporting. That's in train at the moment. I've been promised that in the next fortnight. And from that, then, I will be taking targeted discussions down into SLT and our DMTs, so our strategic and directorate management teams, to reinforce this message and without an automated solution so that we can get that solved. In terms of the periodic risk assessments, as I've touched on, that's ultimately contained in what I'm going to run you through in a bit. In terms of Bribery Act training, my thanks to Andrew and to John McConaughey, our corporate training lead. They have been bringing together the necessary training material. And as can be seen in the content of the slide deck, that training is due to commence this month. Initially with internal audit staff, other selected officers, and very much to sort of test out and ensure that the training is sort of well received and sort of covers off, all the necessary aspects. But the important bit there, and coming back to this point around culture and general awareness. So we've got very specific awareness around some of those areas that carry higher degrees of risk around bribery, fraud and corruption. Areas of procurement and where people are involved in significant procurements. But there also needs to be a more general awareness as well. Where people may, for example, have particular interests that may result in conflicts arising. So we will be looking to develop as well beyond that a bite-sized video, which has worked very successfully in other areas of people services, which allows people to just dip in and maybe for the sake of 6 to 8 minutes of their time can give them a really good overview of the issues that they need to be aware of. Finally, in terms of the CPRs, the contract procedure rules, and the supporting guidance, the buyer's guide, those updates have been completed latterly. We are choosing not to update formally the CPRs at this stage, and the reason for that is that the monitoring officer is currently going through a comprehensive exercise to update the Constitution. Because these things operate somewhat hand in hand, and because the CPRs are in fact embedded within the Constitution, we are looking to actually make that formal update of the CPRs at the time at which the full Constitution comes forward to Council for approval. That said, we will be looking and are in fact communicating out to procuring officers now guidance, which will obviously reflect and mirror the updates in the CPRs, and to ensure that they are obviously abreast of the strengthening of the guidance and the arrangements that have been proposed as a result of the internal audit findings, but that in fact were necessary anyway. In terms of the risk assessment aspect, and this is the overview, there are a couple of slides at the back of the slide deck and available in the agenda pack, which provides a level of detail. We've had some, healthy exchange with colleagues from internal audit, and I think this will be an evolving piece of work, and driven by the fact that there was some good feedback that we've had back in from internal audit colleagues that can go into future updates of the risk assessment. And let's bear in mind, risk assessments are not static and standstill, they're iterative. So whilst you will have a version of it now, it warrants ongoing review and update. So we will look to do that, but that will equally be driven by some of the strengthening of our arrangements. So when I talk on the one hand about our CPRs and the guidance being updated, then I would hope that practice will follow with that. What I want to ensure is that as those arrangements get put into play, we can look at some of the monitoring arrangements in and around, notably our procurement activity, and making sure that risks are, as a result, assessed. And again, that will feed back into the risk assessment then and strengthen it in due course. Obviously, communication and flow of communication between me and Andrew is obviously regular. Andrew and his team is able to confirm to me in terms of the levels of incidents of fraud that they become aware of, going back to Councillor Easton's question of earlier around fraud. Just to reiterate the point from earlier, we're not aware of any definitive cases having been confirmed, in the last year. Yeah, and certainly nothing material. But suffice to say, not a surprise to anybody, in terms of where risk exists, it will be in those areas such as capital, social care, PTU, and where we have some sort of heavy contract arrangements in place. These, I'm not decrying or trying to water down anything, but these are areas that are notoriously difficult where bribery, fraud, and corruption does occur. It is often very, very difficult in order to work them through to a point of satisfactory conclusion. However, we've always got to make sure that a control environment is as robust as possible, and awareness of staff is vitally important, such that any incidences are brought forward to either me or to Andrew. I've talked about practice and culture. Those are the things that I think remain key for me as the sort of designated officer around this area. In terms of mitigation of risks going forward, I've been in discussion with the internal audit team, and I guess not wanting to use my role or influence in any particular way, but what I've said to the internal audit team is that I would like there to be at least an annual review of sorts of our arrangements. So whilst I've had update from the senior auditor today to confirm that the recommendation in the draft report is that we move out of a limited assurance to reasonable, which is good. It shows that our control environment is strengthening and again is reasonable. And I have comfort that for those recommendations which we've agreed with internal audit are partially recommended and will soon to be fully recommended, because the controls have only recently or are now being put in place as we speak. I will have a level of comfort certainly over the next 3 to 6 months that those things are embedded. My focus then is on practice. So what I want to do is, in the audit committee, you receive an audit plan every year. Andrew determines how that audit plan is constructed and conceived. Clearly, that looks at where audit risk exists across the organisation, and part of their work in many of the audits that they undertake will look at, for example, the strength of procurement arrangements, etc., etc. So they, being internal audit, are strengthening some of their sort of monitoring arrangements internally, such that they can provide me with better information as to whether our procurement arrangements are particularly are falling short in any particular areas, I can then, through my risk assessment, I can then target effort and activity as needed around those areas. So if I feel, together with Andrew, that any further work is warranted by way of an annual review, then we will have a discussion. We will just naturally have a discussion around that. But hopefully, all in all, that gives Audit Committee a level of comfort. Clearly, we will have an ongoing touch point. I will be providing an annual review and annual risk assessment back to the committee. And obviously in the interim, we will make good on the progress that I've described.
Well, thank you very much for that full report. Are we going to go back onto the usual configuration? Yes, okay. Are there any questions or observations for Mr. Davies? Councillor Feekins.
Thank you. And just a point of clarity, really. Thanks very much for the report, Peter. At what level do we consider a fraud to be material?
My position would certainly differ from that of Wales Audit Office. It won't be 2.9 million, I can assure you. We don't have a set level. We don't. But in terms of that consistent and firm approach that was talked about at the front end, I don't think it really matters what level of fraud is involved. The action that we take as a consequence of the level of incident of fraud, I guess, will be determined by the investigative work that follows. But Andrew, I'm sure you want to add to that.
Just to add to that, yeah, I think members are probably familiar with the term I use on special investigations. Some of those special investigations could lead to fraud investigations. We will investigate anything that's reported to us, given the sufficient resources. And at an early stage, you often don't know the extent of the fraud involved. So it could be a couple of £100, a couple of £1,000. It could be additional. It could be even more than that as you go through the investigation. What I tend to do is keep chief officers informed of the progress we're making in terms of investigation, and if there's any fraud aspects to it, then we have a conversation about where we take it, whether we continue on an internal basis or whether we need to actually refer it on to the police.
If you want to come back.
Thank you very much. Do obviously within the special investigations and are we relying on whistleblowers as such, or are we relying on us going in and finding fault when we do an audit, or whistleblowers, or is it an element of anything and everybody?
Both. We, as Pete mentioned earlier on, whistleblowing. We've got a whistleblowing policy within the organisation, and there's some key contacts within that. That then filters through to me, potentially to investigate, or we pick up things from the audit work which we're undertaking. And because of things are not right, we follow that through. Or anonymous allegations. So it comes from a variety of sources, and we've got to take a view as to the extent of reasonableness, I guess, and whether we think that it's worth investigating, given the facts at that time. And our role is to either substantiate or refute the allegation that's being made. Yeah, and the other thing that we do for the whole authority is coordinate the NFI, which is the National Fraud Initiative. It's run by the Cabinet Office, covers around about 1,200 different organisations across the UK, and it's a data matching exercise. So we submit data on behalf of Monmouthshire to Cabinet Office. They put it into a machine. They identify matches with our data across all of those organisations, filters back to us, and then my team will check those matches to make sure that there is no fraud. And we, on some occasions, we'll farm that out to service managers, but we coordinate that as well. So we're on top of service managers to make sure that they're completing what they need to do. And sometimes it is an error. Sometimes it's a data cleansing exercise because some of these matches match with deceased persons. So, for example, blue badges. There may not be an abuse of blue badges, but it may just be that the records haven't been updated because of deaths, etc. Or there could well be a continued fraud such as housing benefit fraud, and then we would refer that on to DWP. So there's a range of coverage that we've got and actions we take against potential fraud.
Are there any other questions or observations on this topic? Councillor Strong.
Just one really. It's good that it's going to be a reasonable opinion this time. I just wondered, with the additional work that Andrew's team might expect, will you need extra staff, Andrew, on it?
Yes, Chairman. I think when we come to do the planning process, we'll incorporate that in terms of risk. We'll assess whether that's high, medium or low. We have discussions with heads of service. We'll have discussions with Peter about practicalities, and we'll make sure that we're covering all key aspects for the audit plan.
Thank you very much for that. Mr Davis gave his objectives in his slides. It's largely about informing the Audit Committee to give a background to the current anti-fraud, bribery and corruption policy, internal audit reviews and follow-ups undertaken, and to provide further update to confirm action taken to address outstanding recommendations, to provide an annual risk assessment of the arrangements in place around anti-fraud, bribery and corruption, and to outline the proposed next steps. So it's informing the committee about where we are on those issues. So I can accept that that's been done. Well, thank you very much. I'll move on then to the next item on the agenda, which is the forward work planner. As anyone will know, I am always very eager to have this filled in as fully as possible, and it does look a bit thin at the moment. Unless more business comes forward for the October meeting, we may have to consider whether to go ahead with it. But we don't know at this stage what else might come through. So just to put up a pointer there. Does anybody want to make any further comment about the forward work plan? If not, then I'll move on. We must consider the minutes of the meeting of the 25th of July. Are there any comments or people or observations members of the committee might want to make about the minutes? So we've got a proposal to accept. We've got a second? Yes. Thank you. So we've accepted the minutes as a correct record. And, well, the proposed date for the next meeting will be the 17th of October. So thank you very much, everybody, and for next time.